Good morning, everyone. Um, Hope everyone's having a good Wednesday, despite the quarantine. Hope everyone's staying safe. Um, we're going to continue on with chapter 7. Um, Specifically, we're just really going to go over the War of 1812 today. Um, I had a chance to um, actually sit down and watch my video that I posted Monday, and the audio sucked. So hopefully, I've figured out a better way to do that, and the audio will become, or is much more clear on this video. Um, I think that's everything I have. Um, I'll post more updates in Georgia View as we go along. I want to say thank you to everyone who's continuing to work um, and do the assignments, because it is important, and I appreciate that you're taking it serious, even though we're not able to go to class. Um, I appreciate you logging on to Georgia View, completing the quizzes, watching these um, amazingly boring lectures, um, and suffering through all of my William Shatner-esque pauses. But anyway, let's get into it. For starters, when we talk about the War of 1812, I'm not a military historian. Okay, so I'm not going to sit here and argue which way the wind was blowing on a certain battlefield on a certain day, or any of that. Okay, I respect military historians that they have an important, um, or rather, they give important data to our field of history. Um, but I'm not qualified to speak on military engagements, um, military actions, offensive, defensive strategies. I'm just that's just not me, right? Um, but I'm going to try my best to get through the War of 1812 in the broad sweeping um, categories and topics um, that are essential for a survey level class such as this. Um, we're going to start with Jefferson's embargo, which we talked about Monday. Um, Jefferson retired from the presidency in 1808. Um, so just a year after he implemented the peaceful coercion tactic of the embargo. After he retired, Congress ended the embargo, and the British relaxed their policies toward American ships in terms of impressment and attacking on sight. Um, Despite the embargo's unpopularity, as your textbook says, Jefferson still believes that more time would have proven that the peaceable coercion worked. Right? He's this argument that it wasn't a short scale solution; it was a long scale solution or long term solution. And 1 year wasn't enough to see the actual effects. It was enough time to see the repercussions, the initial repercussions, but it wasn't enough time for it to actually settle in and have a long term effect. Um, so Congress ended the embargo, which was hurting the American economy. Britain relaxed their position, as I just said, but the shadow of war was still there. Like the shadow of conflict was still there. There was still a tension underneath. Um, and as your textbook says, it's a war that would galvanize the young American nation. The galvanization of America during the War of 1812 is one of those broad sweeping topics we're going to talk about. And hopefully, by the end of this lecture, you'll see how it galvanized uh, the United States of America. To start with, you often hear the term um, the straw that broke the camel's back, right? People have different philosophies of history, obviously, because we have bad historians as well as good historians. When it comes to especially wars that are American in nature, or wars that America um, have been involved in, United States of America, you usually see only the one action and then um, the following reaction. It's not a good way to look um, at historical events. There is no straw that broke the camel's back. Okay, um, for my class, who's tired of hearing this, this goes along with World War One and the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. Uh, you have probably been taught, um, or if you've read a good deal, you're probably under the notion that the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand um, kind of directly led to the outbreak of World War One. Right, his assassination sparked a reaction. That reaction sparked an action. That action sparked a reaction. So forth. There was a domino effect, starting with um, the assassination. It's a very simplified way of looking at what would become, a worldwide military conflict, um, at least in the Western society or Western hemisphere. Western society, not Western hemisphere. That was a mistake. Western foreign powers. The problem with that theory is the assassination of one person, really no matter how important they are, would not constitute a global conflict of the scale that World War One was. And the War of 1812 is the same. Right? It wasn't the one time Britain commandeered an American ship and drafted all of the sailors into British service. Okay, what you need uh, is an environment that would culture uh, what we'll call, that military bacteria. Think of it as a petri dish. It has to be, um, you know, or think of a bacterial environment. There has to be, a certain pH level where that bacteria could thrive. Um, there has to be, certain conditions in which that bacteria could live and then maybe reproduce. The military conflicts are roughly the same. There is no one guy kills one guy, the whole world goes to war. There is no one ship um, fires upon another ship, the whole country goes to war. It's not that. If that was the case, the Cold War would have escalated dramatically. There has to be a tension underneath. There has to be um, an underground network of conflict already happening in the psyche, already happening in the environment. Um, for example, if we take the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, it wasn't the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, right? It's not the striking of a match. It's the striking of a match in a room filled with gunpowder. Okay. The War of 1812 stemmed from American entanglement in two distinct sets of international issues. We'll go off the PowerPoint here, which comes directly from the American Yacht textbook. The first had to do with the nation's desire to maintain its position as a neutral trading nation during the series of Anglo-French wars. Now, the Anglo-French wars, I'll call the French Revolutionary Wars. It's the same thing, different terminology, which began in the aftermath of the French Revolution in 1793. So that's your first, for lack of a better term, reason. With France and Britain fighting, America wanted to stay neutral. Second had older roots in the colonial and revolutionary era. In both cases, American interests conflicted with those of the British Empire. British leaders showed little interest in accommodating the Americans. So this is kind of the undertone. This is really going to be the undertone. This is going to be the room filled with gunpowder, right? 1812, Revolutionary War, kind of dwindles down. 1783. You're not talking about a huge span of time here. And you have to remember the pre-Revolutionary War years were fervent with anti-British propaganda. Um, right, there had to be a wave of emotional expression in the colonies in order to get them to unify and fight against an empire. Right? And that propagated information that propagated. Now, I'm not going to say slander. Or not. Some of it wasn't wrong. Some of it wasn't false. But that propagated idea of Britain as the natural enemy, the empire in which you were a citizen, had to be obviously so strong in order to get the citizens, or they thought themselves the British citizens, to fight the British government, British Empire. That doesn't go away. Okay, something that strong, um, to get people who think they are British citizens to fight Britain, something like that obviously has a lasting effect. Obviously has a wave effect. And if you remember with Republican motherhood that we talked about earlier, um, the American nationalism, or the psyche of the American nationalism, wanted to implant this revolutionary um, ideology within the younger generations. They wanted them to come up expecting liberty, expecting individual freedoms, expecting a republic, and kind of mm, fighting back against those who did not represent that. Right? Um, it's in it's a learned bigotry. You're in an environment during your formative years. If you were, a child in the late 18th, early 19th century, you're a child in the formative years in an environment which cultures towards anti-British sentiment, right? Um, anti-monarchy. Um, really, it's kind of the influx of nationalism into a younger generation, right? And this is going to come out, right, in the 19th century with congressmen who were raised or political leaders who were raised being injected with that solely American nationalism, making political decisions now. So we'll go with impressments because that's the action you can actually see. Um, and it has been a point of contention for American policymakers for a very long time. It's been a point of conflict for American citizens for a very long time. Um, well, I say long time, years. Right? It's not centuries or anything, but it's years. Oppressments, we've already talked about this, but it's the practice of forcing American sailors to join the British Navy. Okay, and what would happen is we'll go further back. We'll go where your textbook goes. Your textbook says, driven in part by trade with Europe, the American economy grew quickly during the first decade of the 19th century, right? Or 1800, 1810, creating a labor shortage in the American shipping industry. In response, pay rates for sailors increased, and American captains recruited heavily from the ranks of British sailors. You can see that problem already come into play. But why were they doing that? British citizens weren't gone from what we know now as President of the United States of America after the Revolutionary War. There just were no British garrisons in the United States of America at that time. The United States of America at that time, as you know, was really just the eastern seaboard. So anything west, right, was kind of fair game. British sailors were coming over on merchant ships, right? We're still trading with Britain. We're still trying to trade with European powers. We're still trying to garner a name for ourselves as a player, right, in the international game. So British sailors were present. British citizens were present in the United States. Um, most of them were employed by private entities, so they could, quit their job and go work for an American captain on their ship, right? And there was an incentive to do so because America was paying really good at this time. As a result, around 30% of sailors employed on American merchant ships were British. Um, so it's a pretty good number, almost half. As a republic, the Americans advanced the notion that people could become citizens by renouncing their allegiance to their home nation. Was that, innovation at its finest? Maybe. I mean, the American citizenry, 30 years prior, thought of themselves as British citizenry. So to kind of take that yoke off, all they really could do was just say, we renounce this British citizenship, right? Now some loyalists didn't do this, um, and they were illegally punished. But for the most part, citizens of the United States of America or the American colonies, who were very much for their own geographical home, right, their cultural home, would renounce their British citizenship and take allegiance to the United States of America. And so, for the American government, for the American people, this is all you had to do to renounce your citizenship, to become American. You say, I just renounce Britain, now I'm American, right? The British Empire didn't see it this way. To the British, reading off your textbook again, a person born in the British Empire was a subject of that empire for life, a status they could not change. Excuse me. So we see this conflict already brewing. For Americans, all you had to say was, I renounce my blah 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 previous citizenship. For the British, people that were born in their empire were British. Is that true? No, your textbook got it wrong on there. Sorry. People born in the British Empire were considered under British authority, right? Someone born in India, though, wasn't considered British. They were considered a British subject. Does that make sense? To be considered British, you'd have to have full rights to citizenship, and people born in British colonies obviously did not. Think back to the American Revolution. But you were a British subject, and you just could not remove that yoke by saying something, by saying words. So, to the British sailors and the Americanized, they renounced their citizenship, they're Americans. To the British government, they renounced Britain, doesn't mean anything. Now they're working for America, who might come against us in the French Revolutionary Wars, might not, but it's an unknown entity. Right? So you can kind of see where this is going to play out. The British Navy was embroiled in a difficult war and was unwilling to lose any of its labor force. In order to regain lost crewmen, the British often boarded American ships to reclaim their sailors. Of course, many American sailors found themselves caught up in these sweeps and impressed into the service of the British Navy. Between 1803 and 1812, some 6,000 Americans suffered this fate. The British would release Americans who could prove their identity, but this process could take years, while the sailor endured harsh conditions and dangers of the Royal Navy. It wasn't, great to be a sailor at the time, right? You didn't get to wear a little fancy white suit and parade up and down streets. It was hard work. It could be fatal work, especially for those impressed, because they were at the bottom rung. They were given the worst jobs, right? They weren't galleymen. They were, grunts. And grunts in a navy in the 19th century was not a place you want to be. But even if you could prove your citizenship, there was really no guarantee Britain would take it, unless maybe the government intervened, the United States government intervened, and it's kind of I caught you, I have you, you know, you can try to get out, but you have to go through the bureaucratic process. Even though we didn't go through the bureaucratic process when we impressed you, right? It was kind of a power move by Britain. In 1806, responding to a French declaration of a complete naval blockade of Great Britain, the British demanded that neutral ships first carry their goods to Britain to pay a transit duty before they could proceed to France. Despite loopholes in these policies between 1807 and 1812, Britain, France, and their allies seized about 900 American ships, prompting a swift and angry American response. Right? France, 1806, had created a naval blockade of Great Britain. What's that? It's a bulwark of ships where foreign ships couldn't get into Britain, right? Um, so Britain combated this, and it was really kind of targeted with the United States in mind. Combated this by saying you have to get in because you have to pay transit duty, even if you are trading with France. So, what do? You try to get past the naval blockade and maybe get fired upon by the French, maybe get captured by the French, or do you just go to France and if you come across a British ship, maybe you get fired upon by the British ship or impressed into that service, right? Catch 22. That Catch 22 obviously resulted in 900 American ships being seized. We're still in Jefferson presidency here. Jefferson's embargo sent the nation into a deep depression, drove exports down from the 108 million in 1807 to 22 million in 1808. 70 something million dollars. 70 something million dollars in the early 19th century is a lot of money. And it had little effect on Europeans. Within 15 months, Congress repealed the Embargo Act. This is after the Jefferson presidency had ended, replacing it with smaller restrictions on trade with Britain and France. Although efforts to stand against Great Britain had failed, resentment of British trade policy remained widespread. American people were seeing this, American policymakers were seeing this. The embargo didn't affect Britain, but it hurt us. Our restrictions aren't really hurting Britain. And even though we're resigned to be neutral, we're still being kind of pushed around by the British Empire. Far from the Atlantic Ocean on the American frontier, Americans were also at odds with the British Empire. From their position in Canada, right, Newfoundland, New British Canada, the Britons were in modern day Canada, which was just to the north of the American colonies. From their position in Canada, the British maintained relations with Native Americans in the Old Northwest, supplying them with goods and weapons in an attempt to maintain ties in case of another war with the United States. We saw this with the American Revolution, right, where the majority of Native American tribes sided with Britain because they were afraid of an American victory, because an American victory in their eyes would result in Americans wanting more and more land. Were they right? Absolutely. They're right. I mean, obviously. But they were still a major ally for the British military. And Britain wanted to maintain that relationship. Even though most of those Native American tribes were punished for siding with Britain, especially in the south with the Cherokees. But up north, Britain still wanted to kind of maintain that ties in case they could see a conflict coming. They just didn't know what scale of conflict it would be. And in preparation of that, if they had good ties with the Native Americans would side with them again. The threat of a native uprising increased after 1805 when Tenskwatawa and Tecumseh built their alliance. The territorial governor of Illinois, William Henry Harrison, eventually convinced the Madison administration to allow for military action against Native Americans in the Ohio Valley. James Madison is now the president, fourth president. The resulting Battle of Tippecanoe drove the followers of the prophet from their gathering place, but did little to change the dynamics of the region. British efforts to arm and supply Native Americans, however, angered Americans and strengthened anti-British sentiments. So the prophet could be the prophet that they're talking about is Tenskwatawa, right? But if you go back and if you look at Native American policies for the United States, again in Chapter 7, the prophet started before Tecumseh, but Tecumseh kind of carried it. And what the prophet message was, the message of the prophet, even though the prophets changed, the actual person changed, the message of the prophets was that of a Native American movement, a unification of Native American identity in order to fight back against American land grabs, right? Mm. The battle could typically drive the followers of the prophet from their gathering place. Right? So, oh yeah, sorry, I didn't put this in the PowerPoint. Battle of Tippecanoe was lost for the Native Americans. um, pushed them out of Illinois and the Indiana region. But it didn't really accomplish anything. However, now America knew that, or they had known that Britain was arming and supplying the Native Americans. And at this point, now the United States of America is seeing the Native Americans as a threat, right? Political and physical threat. So how Britain saw the United States um, siding with France in their allegiance to be neutral, now we see, or the Americans see, that Britain is trying, or they're thinking that Britain is trying to supplant the American colonies. Right? They're going to invade because they're obviously already helping the Native Americans, and they're trying to push the Native Americans into another war with the United States. Right? So they're kind of seeing this play out in undertones, but it's very serious undertones. Republicans began to talk of war as a solution to these problems, arguing that it was necessary to complete the war for independence by preventing British efforts to keep America subjugated at sea and on land. The war would also represent another battle against the Loyalists, some 38,000 of whom had populated Upper Canada after the Revolution, and sought to establish a counter to the radical experiment of the United States. In 1812, the Republicans held 75% of the seats in the House and 82% of the Senate, giving them a free hand to set national policy. Among them were the War Hawks, whom one historian describes as too young to remember the horrors of the American Revolution, and thus willing to risk another British war to vindicate the nation's rights and independence. Right, let's break all this down. Republicans had the majority. Even though the Jefferson presidency had ended, Republicans still had the majority over Federalists in the American government. They started to talk of war as a solution to these problems. These problems, right, was British impressment, British arming and supplying Native Americans, um, British siding with the Native Americans in revolt, which kind of came into the picture with Tippecanoe. Britain still seizing American ships, right, in part because of the French naval blockade. Right? There's a resentment to Britain here. That is actual. That is physical, right? You can actually see why. I mean, there's also an undertone of that American nationalism that was implanted in the American youth, which are now policymakers. This Britain bad, America good mentality. The war would also represent another battle against the Loyalists. The Loyalists, of course, are those who sided with Britain. American colonists who sided with Britain during the American Revolution. Um, they were subject to harassment, sometimes physical punishment for siding with Britain after the Revolutionary War had ended, and they'd all kind of migrated up north to where there was still British presence in Canada, and they had set up their own colonies, so to speak, which they saw as just a British colony. It was a colony um, who is made up of British subjects who were loyal to Britain, and dependent on Britain. And so the war would also represent another battle against the Loyalists. What they're meaning to say here, or in other words, if war came to pass, the first people to fight would be the Northern Americans against the Canadian British. Right? It's not right to call them Canadian British, but the British loyalists in Canada. Right? Because there's already colonies there. There's already a presence there. Britain doesn't have to ship over another army. There's almost a ready militia there, and they're going to be on the front lines. In 1812, the Republicans held 75%. We just talked about this. Republicans still had the power, and among them were the War Hawks. Now we're going to talk about War Hawks because I'm not sure if you have discussed War Hawks in high school, maybe, or in other history classes. A War Hawk is simply a policymaker, politician who advocates for military conflict, a military conflict, war. The opposite would be a dove, right? And we see that later on in the Vietnam War, in a much more larger extent. When we're talking about war hawks, especially if we take this historian's quote, too young to remember the horrors of the American Revolution. Most policymakers, um, like Clay and Calhoun, were very important in the discussion of American politics at the time, but they didn't fight in the American Revolution. And I mean, you're talking 1812. The revolution ended in 1780s or the 1780s. Right? You're talking about a span of someone could be born at the end of the Revolutionary War or after and still be old enough to be a policymaker, right? Be old enough to be a congressman. Um, so most of these congressmen and senators didn't have to go through the Revolutionary War. They didn't have to go through, excuse me, the horrible conflict that is war and all of the negatives, right? Though they were brought up in this Republican motherhood, in this stage of American nationalism, where 13 little colonies beat a huge British Empire, everything was dandy, we're independent, we're free now, right? And that, that's oversimplification, and that's maybe painting them as stupid. They're not. We're all impacted by American nationalism. You can say you're not, you are. But these are the policymakers now, and those policymakers see themselves being bullied, right? That's the picture they're painting, or they're seeing Britain paint. They're being bullied, they're being pushed around by a country that their fathers had already beat, right? So they advocated for war, right? If we beat them once, we can beat them again. Come on, Madison, let's just go ahead and fight them. You see the same thing later on when we get into Vietnam. When we get into Vietnam, or the escalation to Vietnam, Lyndon's listening to his Warhawk advisors, Robert McNamara, Walt, what's his name? Rostow. I'm sorry, he was a chairman in one of the cabinet departments of Johnson. They were Warhawks. They were wanting Johnson to escalate military presence in Vietnam, right? And even though they were veterans in World War II, they never saw action. They were part of the statistical branch of the OSS. They never had to really see the horror that is war on the front line, right? And most war hawks won't, but most of us don't see war either, right? It's more of a philosophical kind of difference of combating a problem. But war hawks in this context, especially in the War of 1812, were very young. Don't have to live through the Revolutionary War. They did live through it. They didn't live, to fight it. They weren't old enough to fight in it. They probably don't remember much about it. And they're advocating for violence, not to say, "Oh, that's a bad thing." Advocating to fight the British Empire, right? Because they think they could just it would. One, they obviously think they can win, otherwise they wouldn't advocate it. And two, they think it would solve the problems that they were having, as well as taking care of that undercurrent or that undertone that Britain's still here. Britain's still trying to usurp America. They don't see us as serious, and they're still seizing our ships. Right? And that's what these warhawks are trying to combat. These warhawks pretty much convinced Madison they were right. Convinced by the Warhawks and his party, Madison drafted a statement of the nation's disputes with the British and asked Congress for a war declaration on June 1st, 1812. The Republicans hoped that an invasion of Canada might remove the British from their backyard and force the Empire to change their naval policies. After much negotiation in Congress over the details of the bill, Madison signed a declaration of war on June 18, 1812. For a second time, the United States was at war with Great Britain. We really need to go on that. That's pretty self-explanatory. While the War of 1812 contained two key players, the United States and Great Britain, it It also drew in other groups such as Tecumseh, who we talked about in the Indian Confederacy. The war can be organized into 3 stages or theaters. The first, the Atlantic Theater, lasted until the spring of 1813, so just not really a year. During this time, Great Britain was chiefly occupied in Europe against Napoleon. Remember, they still find the French Revolutionary Wars. And the United States invaded Canada and sent their fledgling navy against British ships. During the second stage, from early 1813 to 1814, the United States launched a second offensive against Canada and the Great Lakes. In this period, the Americans won their first success. So this is just fighting the Northern Americans, fighting the British Canadians, naval battles in the Great Lakes, physical battles in the Northwest. The old Northwest, not like Oregon. The third stage, the Southern Theater, concluded with Andrew Jackson's January 1815 victory outside New Orleans, Louisiana. This is probably the most important. This is probably Jackson's victory in Louisiana set the stage for the mindset changing. The mindset that we can win this. We've won this. Kind of where America, we're bulletproof. 6 foot tall and bulletproof. There's even a song. I can't remember. Oh, hold on. Let me Google that. It was a big song. Battle of New Orleans, obviously, by Johnny Horton. I couldn't remember the name. Johnny Horton. Still very much part of the American nationalistic persona in history. So not only did it impact Americans at the time, Jackson's victory in New Orleans, it impacted America pretty much afterwards, right? It's kind of proof that we could beat the British anytime we tried. And Jackson was, our man to do it. Was Jackson a horrible man? Absolutely. Was he a good military leader? Well, pretty self-evident, I think. So we're starting to see Calhoun's, or not Calhoun's, but these younger congressmen's ideas of military conflict, that we beat British once, our fathers beat Britain, we can beat Britain. It's kind of coming to pass, or at least the mindset of the American psyche is shifting more towards that. After the land campaign of 1812 failed to secure America's war aims, America turned to the infant navy in 1813. Remember Jefferson cut Standing Army by huge supply. We still had a militia, but America's navy really didn't take off until Theodore Roosevelt. In any comparison to other foreign entities that had large navies. So we hired privateers. We talked about that before. We know what privateers are. The U.S. Navy, the small thing it was, rallied behind the slogan, free trade and sailors' rights. Right? This was a direct insult to the impressment policy of Britain. Although the British possessed the most powerful navy in the world, surprisingly, the young American Navy extracted early victories with larger, more heavily armed ships. Early on, Americans humiliated the British in single-ship battles. In retaliation, Captain Philip Broke of the HMS Shannon attacked the USS Chesapeake, captained by James Lawrence, on June 1st, 1813. Within 6 minutes, the Chesapeake was destroyed and Lawrence mortally wounded. Philip Broke, obviously British, HMS, His Majesty's ship, the Shannon, attacked the United States ship Chesapeake. Sorry, gosh. So American ships were winning, right? Surprise to everyone, I think, including the American ships. They were winning. This put the, kind of aristocratic British military navy leaders on edge. Kind of made them tense. Probably made them way more angry, right? Broke decided to prove a point. He did. And he destroyed the USS Chesapeake. 2.5 months later, the USS Constitution squared off with the HMS Guerriere. As the Guerriere tried to outmaneuver the Americans, the Constitution pulled along broadside and began hammering the British frigate. I missed a slide here. Let me see if I have it in my. The Guerriere returned fire, but as one sailor observed, the cannonball simply bounced off the Constitution's thick hull. Constitution became known as Old Ironsides. I'm sure you've heard of Old Ironsides. In less than 35 minutes, the grave was so badly damaged that it was set aflame rather than taken as a prize. Right, it was a scuttle. If you didn't want, especially at this time with the American Navy being so small, it needed all the ships it could get. If it could defeat the British ship, or wound it so bad that the crew gave up, they would take that ship, put it, repair it, put it back in the United States service. So Britain would scuttle those ships. They would destroy the ships. It's an old technique, and it's still used today in modern navies. In 1814, Americans gained naval victories on Lake Champlain near Plattsburgh, prevented British land invasion of the United States on the Chesapeake Bay at Fort McHenry, Baltimore. Fort McHenry, you should know. Fort McHenry repelled the 19-ship British fleet, enduring 27 hours in bombardment, virtually unscathed. Why did I not put this up here? Watching from aboard a British ship, American poet Francis Scott Key penned the verses of what would become the national anthem, the Star Spangled Banner. Right? You know this? Yeah. And I hope you're seeing, right, the impact of the War of 1812. We're going to talk about the impact it had at the time, but I hope you're seeing the impact it has, it has lasted, or the effect that it has kind of trickled down, right? When we talk about galvanizing the American nation, it didn't just galvanize the American nation at the time, right? That galvanization just transcribed back into the American nationalism, or rather seeped back into the American nationalism, fueled it again, right? And threw it on down the line. Impressive though these accomplishments, or they belied what was actually a poorly executed military campaign against the British. The U.S. Navy won their most significant victories in the Atlantic Ocean in 1813. Napoleon's defeat in early 1814, however, allowed the British to focus on North America and blockade American ports. Thanks to the blockade, the British were able to burn Washington, D.C. on August 24, 1814, and open a new theater of operations in the South. For those of you who visited the White House, you know that the White House was burnt down. But this is the important part. Napoleon was defeated in 1814. So when we talk about the American nationalism and American, having these victories, Britain was fighting a war on all fronts here. Now, no one was trying to invade Britain on the American side, but they were fighting on the Atlantic and their eastern coast with France, right? When Napoleon was defeats. We're not going into the European history now. Well, it's like Napoleon was defeated in 1814. Now Britain doesn't have to worry about the French side of the conflict. Now they can put all their attention on America. And you're talking in the span of 6 months, they went from losing naval battles to an infant navy, not a poorly outfitted navy, but an infant navy comprised mostly of private ships. Losing a significant conflict in New Orleans. Now that they could focus their energy, within a couple of months, they just walked up and burned the White House. British sailed for New Orleans, where they achieved a naval victory at Lake Huron before losing the land invasion to Jackson. We talked about this. This American victory actually came after the United States and the United Kingdom signed the Treaty of Ghent on December 24th. But the Battle of New Orleans proved to be a psychological victory that boosted American morale. The Treaty of Ghent essentially returned relations between the United States and Britain to their pre-war status. It really didn't solve anything. War, however, mattered politically and strengthened American nationalism. During the war, Americans read patriotic newspaper stories, sang patriotic songs, Star Spangled Banner became one of them, and bought consumer goods decorated with national emblems. They also heard stories about how the British and their native allies threatened to bring violence into American homes. It is a threat that works for American propaganda, American nationalistic propaganda. It's the reason why we don't have a Department of War anymore, and it changed its name to Department of Defense, right? We have to fight them there, or they'll fight us here. To fight in our homes, we have to keep everything away from our homes, right? It's a government propaganda scheme, but it works. It's a nationalism that works. It's nationalism that seeps through. It's nationalism you think of right now when you think of patriotism in America. This is what you're thinking of. Now, you probably don't want to hear why it was influenced or how it became about, or the real reason of it. But this is why you're influenced the way you're influenced, and it is present in everywhere. United States of America. It's present everywhere. in most Western countries with a sense of nationalism, and now the Eastern countries after the social movements, like in China, nationalism is present everywhere. I love nationalism. We're talking about nationalism. If you really want to read a good book about nationalism, Imagine Communities is a great one, by oh, what is his name? Benedict Anderson. Um, it's a great book. It was published in the 80s. It's kind of like the quintessential, if you're looking at the history of nationalism or nationalist historians, it's really a key book, a key word to read. But we won't talk about that anymore. What may have been the boldest declaration of Americans' post-war pride came in 1823. President James Monroe issued an ultimatum to the empires of Europe in order to support several wars of independence in Latin America. The Monroe Doctrine, please remember this as an important term, declared that the United States considered its entire hemisphere, both North and South America, off limits to new European colonization. Although Monroe was a Jeffersonian, some of his principles echoed Federalist policies. Whereas Jefferson cut the size of the military and ended all internal taxes in his first term, Monroe advocated the need for a strong military and an aggressive foreign policy. Since Americans were spreading out over the continent, Monroe authorized the federal government to invest in canals and roads. You know those canals and roads. The Monroe Doctrine, as it plainly states, just kind of tells Europeans back off, right? Even if Europeans were in Brazil or Argentina, Monroe says back off, right? We don't want you anywhere near our hemisphere. You stay on that side of the ocean, we'll stay on this side of the ocean. You can trade with us, right? But we don't want you anywhere near here. It isn't as concrete as you think, but the Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, this was kind of his basis of foreign policy, the Monroe Doctrine, and he made it stronger, which you'll talk about in History 2112, the next series of American history. But it was kind of that, the treaty again doesn't mean we had American victory, but at the time, because American nationalism was so strong, America had come into its own kind of in military conflicts. It could show the world anyway that it fought British twice and hasn't. It didn't lose, right? They're kind of coming off this high, and in that high, Monroe again tells Europe to back off, right? You stay on your continent, we'll stay on our continent. Anything that happens on our continent is in our interest, right? And that's kind of where the Monroe Doctrine comes about, and the Roosevelt Corollary, which strengthened the Monroe Doctrine later on. And that's it for today. Don't worry about this chapter 10. This PowerPoint was from the last semester. We're going to go straight into chapter 8. But next week, you're going to have your exam. So we're going to postpone chapter 8. Remember, the exams over 5, 6, and 7. I'll put the study guide up. I remember to do chapter 7 quiz this week. That's up. If you have any questions, please contact me.